Okay, 20 minutes.
Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to present this project on religion again, shaping religious identities. Let me motivate by why we should care about religion in the first place. So religion has played a primary role in human societies for millennia and continues to do so for billions around the globe. It also is a major source of organization of society. So major cleavages within and across societies are often oriented around religious identities. Think about conflict between Muslims and Hindi in the context of India, Pakistan, Christians, Muslims, but also within denominations, so the Shia-Sunni split, or in my case, the split between Protestants and Catholics in the Christian world. We also have rich evidence by now, I think. There's a huge literature showing that religion really matters, so depending on which side of this cleavage you fall on, determines a long range of outcomes, norms and institutions, human capital investments, economic development in general, but also the dark side of religion, like religious persecution and conflict. How we usually think about religious identity in economics traditionally is kind of still based on this seminal work by Acton and Cranton, where religious identity is deeply entrenched in individuals' lives. We see in the Verdier model that tells us that values and beliefs are passed on from one generation to the other, and this can create this high degree of cultural persistence. What we have less understanding of is what are the origins of religious identities and how they change over time. In particular, when do small divisions in religious identity turn into salient societal cleavages? And it kind of relates to an ongoing debate, for example, that we have in the US, when you have this realignment from class identity to cultural identity as kind of the major defining feature which people sought to. It's empirically challenging to do that in the context of religions because usually they're so deep rooted in the past that we cannot observe a marker of identity over a long period of time, ideally spanning the time before a religion starts, during its inception, and then tracing it over the centuries. As previewed by the title, the laboratory I'm going to look at is the Protestant Reformation in early modern Germany. I'm going to use first names as a marker of identity expression and trace essentially the entire time period from before the Reformation starts up until the end of the Holy Roman Empire. The setting is also interesting because some anecdotal evidence tells us that there's some change in how people perceive religious identity in this context. So the French philosopher Montaigne travels through Germany in 1580 and observes in the city of Augsburg that marriages between Catholics and Protestants take place daily. The part that has the most desire accepts the faith of the other. There are thousands of such marriages. Our host, for example, was a Catholic. His wife was a Protestant. And he doesn't just make this up. If you look at the marriage records in Augsburg in the period between 1580 and 1590, population shares are roughly equal between Catholics and Protestants. Almost a quarter of the marriages are across religious boundaries. So it's a really fluid concept of what does it mean to be Protestant and Catholic, can easily convert, easily switch. If you move fast forward 300 years, there's church historian Harnack who observes, for the case of Germany, that in numerous and important questions of life and of the common weal, our nation is at the outset divided into two camps. Everywhere one confronts confessional prejudice, everywhere one encounters defense, indeed the wall of confession, so a really rigid perception of the other group. And this is reflected same setting, city of Augsburg, where you still can marry across religious boundaries. At the end of the 18th century, the intermarriage rates virtually plummet to zero. So that already tells you that there is some meaningful change in how Catholics and Protestants see each other over time. Yes.
Clarifying, the proportion of Protestants also changed a lot over this time period?
Yes, this is really just looking at the city of Augsburg, which is a rare exception. It's bi-confessional. We have Catholics and Protestants living in the same place, and they have the right to actually convert and marry across boundaries. Usually it's completely segregated that the ruler determines whether you're Protestant or Catholic.
The dates that you're showing is your choice, it's just because this is the data that you have.
This is just the data that I have. I don't have the entire timeline because they don't have, like some historian did some archival work before. I didn't go through all the marriage records. So what I'm going to do in this paper, essentially three research questions. The first part is a more descriptive part to try to understand how and when the Protestants and Catholics developed distinct identities, kind of filling this gap that I have between the two snapshots in time. And the second part is to try to understand what drives variation in identity investments. I'm going to argue it's mostly a supply side story of both churches investing heavily in persuading people of becoming more extreme in their confessional identity. Third part, I'm not going to show anything on this, but there are also some social and economic consequences of it. So identity translate into meaningful behavior, social cohesion, but also individual career choices. The data that I'm going to use for measuring kind of the ideology and the supply of the two camps on the intellectual level is going to come from short titles, very similar to what Katharina has been using. I'm using the universal short title catalog that spans the time period from 1500 to 1700 to identify when Catholics and Protestants develop distinct narratives in the books that they write. And then to look at the identity expression of the congregants, of the common people, I look at first names from baptism records. Part of that also is from family search. Another part is freshly digitized from baptism records on my own. And then I complement it with information on students from matriculation lists, because baptism books are actually an invention of the Protestant Reformation. They take shape only in the 1550s, so for the early periods. It's mostly going to be students. But I have some robustness that's not driven by compositional changes. To study the drivers of investments in identity, I look at local church capacity. For the Catholics, it's going to be mostly Jesuit colleges, which is the monastic order at the forefront of promoting the Counter-Reformation. For Protestants, I use as a proxy church visitations, where the central church authority sends an inspector to a local parish and checks whether the priest is actually teaching everything in line with official doctrine and has the right to replace them. I also have some ongoing work to show that this actually translates also in changes in priest quality, but not part of the results today. Measurement, how do I think about how distinct Catholics and Protestants are? It's always going to be based essentially on this idea by against Bishop Peter and Teddy measuring partisanship in congregational speech. The idea is always, does the text, in this case, do the words contain some information or content about whether this text is written by a Protestant or Catholic? So the higher the predictive power of a prediction exercise based on the text is, the clearer the demarcation is between the two groups. Same for first names. If the naming distributions are exactly equal, the name doesn't tell me anything about whether you're a Catholic or Protestant. But when naming distributions diverge, and if I ask a person in 1650, what's their name, and they tell me it's Anton, I get some information about the fact that he is Catholic. And all these measures are exactly capturing this intuition that as the distributions diverge more, this measure will be higher. For identification, looking at what drives this variation, I'm using geographic and temporal variation and when those expansions of local church capacity take place. I'm going to do some Rusak and Hall adjustments, as we have seen before, to take into account kind of the strategy of the expansion path and rule out some clear patterns that they had in where they placed Jesuit colleges. Key findings is really in the descriptive part that it takes time for differentiation to happen both in first names and in the intellectual space. And I can show a clear link between investments in higher local church capacity, and these places are the ones that display more distinct confessional identities. Yes?
Just so I understand, so your story is about the capacity of the church. Where in your story does political leaders think? Do they have any role, or merely focusing on the church and we should abstract away from any political leadership?
I'm really merely focusing on the church. I kind of leave the state out. In this time period, it's very much an alliance between state and church usually, so it goes hand in hand. Where the Jesuits go, they need to get some buy-in by the local ruler. So you can think of their incentives in this context usually aligned. The entire confessionalization hypothesis in this historiography really sees this also as a part of the expansion of the early modern state, where church is just so much intertwined with the secular authority that you can think of them pursuing similar goals in this context. Okay, so very brief historical background, 1 minute run through the Protestant Reformation. In the German context, it all starts with Martin Luther publishing his 95 Theses in 1517. And there's a process of formalizing the Lutheran or the Protestant faith in this context. So the first real written document where they write down what does it mean to be a Protestant is the Augsburg Confession in 1530. And it's accompanied not only by this kind of sharpening of what is the ideology, but also really a church reform where they try to train new priests that can preach the new creed. They formalize obligations to attend church and church ordinances, send those visitations to local parishes to really establish the new faith. So it has both dimensions, this ideological dimension and this organizational dimension. And it's the same for the Catholic response, the Counter-Reformation, where the strategy is mostly decided during this Council of Trent, that also has exactly those two elements. They discuss what does it mean to be Catholic, but they also really implement church reform, overhauling priest training, standardizing what they teach, like the catechisms, come up exactly in this time. They do have religious conflict, which is settled after the First War in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, and this boils down to this famous formula, prius regio eius religio. So the ruler determines the confession of the subjects. So think about this as a context where the subjects cannot choose whether they're Catholic or Protestants. They can just choose how strongly they identify with either being Catholic or Protestant. The big religious conflict is then 1618 to 1648, the 30 Years' War. After that, they go back to the same formula until the end of the Holy Roman Empire. Not much changes here. So just to kind of fix ideas, how can we think about it? I lean here on the political polarization literature, mostly some models by Cenaioli and Tabellini on identity politics. But think about the population as distributed on an ideological spectrum. So you have the Protestant extreme on the right side, the Catholic extreme on the left side. And the church chooses kind of their doctrine, their ideal point in this ideological spectrum, and the congregants are distributed around this. And in the initial state, they only have the Catholic Church. They can make two choices. Where do they place themselves in terms of ideology, but they can also choose how much effort do they invest into persuading people of aligning with their ideas.
Just my ignorance.
Yeah.
Ideology in terms of what?
This is really like a reduction to a one-dimensional space. It's the entire bundle boiled down.
But still, what was the main? What's the main?
I mean, the access to God is kind of the main diversion. How do you access God? For the Catholics, it has to be intermediated by the priest. For Protestants, you have this direct connection, for example. But it's a bundle.
Okay.
Yes. So what churches do is choosing this point, and what they also choose is how much effort they provide into convincing people of actually moving to their ideal point. So you have the Protestant church entering. They have a different ideal point more to the Protestant ideology, and people might move a little bit, but you need effort to push them all the way. There's a Catholic response. I'm not going to go into detail why they have this incentive to differentiate, but the crucial point here is that there's some complementarity between their investments into persuasive capacity. So the more easy it is to persuade people, the more extreme you can be in your ideology, because you can then push people towards that more extreme point.
Why don't you get a medium voter type of?
I mean, there's different motives, like Trevi and friends, they just say there's some value in being different, for example.
Is there some ideological desire, like some bliss point as well?
Yes, or you can think about, if you want to microphone it as, they are averse to conversion, so they really want stability. The more distinct you are from the other group, the more control you have over your own population, so you don't want to have the others turning the other faith.
There's also a big club with dimension.
Exactly. So the more extreme you are, you have more buy-in. Maybe you can extract more resources. That's the Larry Yanakona model, for example. Exactly. So this is kind of thinking about it in two things. I'm going to show. Yeah.
I thought that just during this period is already the ruler chose the religion you just mentioned, and why they are still the church trying to convert people.
I mean, it's still kind of a social equilibrium, right? Like if all your people demand Protestantism, it's a bit difficult for the ruler to convert to Catholicism. At the end of this period, for example, if you have, I don't know, at the Napoleonic Wars, Bernadotte taking over the throne in Sweden, he has to convert to Protestantism because everyone is Protestant in Sweden. So he gives up as a ruler his faith to adjust to the population. So
even though he gets to decide what the religion will be,
but it's very
doesn't ban those other churches, right? So those churches can still be working and still operating. Like,
Yeah, but it's very costly to convert everyone once they are on an extreme position and you are a new ruler coming in, want to change their religious identity. It's very costly to do that, right? So that's kind of the thing. But maybe we can discuss later about this. What I'm going to do in descriptive results to measure this difference in ideology, I'm going to look at the short titles and see how they are distinct from each other. For the difference in the congregants' beliefs, I'm looking at first names and how they diverge over time. So how does it look? If I look at these short titles and ask how predictive is the short title of you being Catholic or Protestant? At the beginning, book prints by Catholics and Protestants are very similar. If I just read the book, I cannot explicitly tell whether it's Catholic or Protestant. But over time, you have a slight increase that really is accelerating in the 1580s, 1600, leading up to the 30 years war. So you have this increase in ideological polarization. Does this translate into how people name their kids, so the identity expression of the common people? Yes, it does. So here I actually have a pre-period because I can just look at towns that eventually turn Protestant and say that they are already Protestant in 1480. It's very flat in the beginning, 1580, remember this quote, still rather low. And then you have this sudden dramatic shift to very distinct naming patterns in the time period leading up to the 30 years war. And you reach apparently a new equilibrium that then is very stable up until the end of the Holy Roman Empire. So those two descriptive facts in hand, I, in the second part of the paper, really try to understand whether this expansion of local church capacity is driving that, so whether it's really a supply side story. And for the Catholics, I'm going to rely on this staggered rollout or arrival of Jesuit colleges, which is a bundle. They direct indoctrination, but they also teach priests to be more extreme. So let me be a bit brief on that. But as you can see, there's geographic variation, there's also temporal variation when they come. We can also look at the areas not directly the cities where they go to, but a buffer kind of around it, cut out the city where they go and just look at the surrounding countrysides. The idea is they are the priests that are trained at a Jesuit college, go back to the countryside, and those are more exposed to those Catholic ideas. Some of these places will always get Jesuit exposure just because it's cities that have existing education infrastructure are bigger, the Jesuits will always go there. There's other places where it's more surprising, so I use counterfactual simulations to adjust for what you would expect as Jesuit exposure just based on city characteristics and where you are located in Germany. And the red areas are the ones that get a surprising Jesuit exposure, whereas the light yellow ones, for example, you would expect based on their location and city characteristics that they will get Jesuit exposure, but they don't.
So that's your measure of demand, where the part that's in excess of the predictive part? I mean, sorry, of supply.
Of supply.
Yeah.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
otherwise, I mean, I wasn't clear how you're distinguishing between supply and demand.
Yeah, no, this is the measure
This is your measure
of supply.
of
So
supply, the part that's above the predictive.
exactly.
Okay.
And then I'm running a standard two-way fixed effect model. Due to the staggered adoption, I use the Callaway-Santana estimator. The adjustment helps with balance and observables. And the event study is kind of when the Jesuits arrive. And here the Protestant name score, it's 0 when it's uniquely used by Catholics, 1 if it's uniquely used by Protestants, 0.5 if it's used at the same rate. You can clearly see that once the Jesuits arrive, you have this move into more distinctly Catholic names.
Still a bit confused. How do you know that that surprise part is not just that surprise demand, but supply? You know, how do you know that? Because those characteristics would also predict demand.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think I can't perfectly isolate it, but I mean, I do a similar thing also for the Protestant side, where I look at these church visitations, also where they send a local inspector, so that's really more like, once again, a central authority sending someone to check up on the local parish. I can't completely rule out that it's demand driven, that's for sure. So I take it with a grain of salt as a fact. I think I'm just wrapping up. What I'm doing here is I provide a new data set spanning more than 300 years to measure how religious identity diverges over time. And the key insight is really that the Protestant Reformation does not seem to reflect pre-existing differences measured in first names or in book prints. And where the churches invest a lot in supply, it seems to drive religious differentiation. And then there's some additional evidence that this actually matters for individual behavior, but also for group cohesion.